80 years ago, in the frozen valleys of North Africa, a British commander named General Bernard Montgomery believed he had executed the perfect tactical maneuver. On the night of November 4th, 1942, he had surrounded 15 Uzurzera German and Italian troops near a place called Sidi Rezeg. The British forces numbered over 50, Uzurzera. The Germans were trapped. The victory seemed assured. By dawn on November 5th, 200 British soldiers were dead or wounded. The Germans had vanished like smoke into the desert. What happened in those 12 hours between sunset and sunrise remains one of the most contested nights in North African campaign history. The official British records claim mechanical failure and poor coordination. The German accounts speak of genius and desperation. But the truth, buried in declassified files until 2003, reveals something far more complex. A catastrophe born from hubris, miscalculation, and the fragility of command under pressure. General Montgomery was a meticulous planner. He had spent 3 weeks preparing Operation Supercharge, the final assault designed to break the Axis forces and secure Egypt for the Allies. Every detail had been calculated, every regiment positioned with mathematical precision, every supply line accounted for. But he had made one critical assumption, that the Germans would fight where the British expected them to fight. The battlefield was called the Alamein Line, a narrow corridor between the Mediterranean Sea and the Qattara Depression, a vast salt marsh impassable to vehicles. The Germans occupied fortified positions along this line. Montgomery's strategy was to penetrate at the weakest point, pour armor through the gap, and encircle the German forces from behind. It was textbook military doctrine. It should have worked. On November 3rd, 1942, at 21:40 hours, the British artillery barrage began. Over 800 guns fired continuously for 4 hours. The ground shook. The sky glowed orange with muzzle flashes. The sound was described by survivors as the end of the world being announced. When the barrage lifted, the British infantry advanced. They broke through the German lines. They pushed forward into the darkness. By midnight, they had created a gap nearly 2 kilometers wide. General Montgomery stood in his command tent, studying maps by lamplight. His chief of staff, Brigadier Charles Auchinleck, approached with the latest reconnaissance reports. "Sir, the German positions are fragmenting," Auchinleck reported. "Our armor is moving through the gap. We estimate full encirclement within 6 hours." Montgomery nodded. He had trained his entire career for this moment. The precision, the timing, the absolute control over the battlefield. This was victory arriving on schedule. What neither man knew was that the German commander, General Erwin Rommel, was 200 kilometers away in Berlin, attending medical treatment for recurring health issues. Command had fallen to General Georg Stumme, a competent but cautious officer who lacked Rommel's intuitive boldness. Stumme, however, had one advantage. He was desperate. At 15 hours on November 4th, Stumme received a coded radio message from his reconnaissance units. The British forces had split into 3 distinct columns, separated by gaps of up to 800 meters. They were advancing in darkness without proper coordination between armor and infantry support. Stumme made a decision that would define the next 12 hours. Rather than consolidate and defend, he would attack. At 03:45 hours, German forces began moving, not in retreat, in assault. The German attack was coordinated with almost surgical precision. 3 panzer divisions, supported by Italian armor and German infantry, moved against the British columns with a speed that should have been impossible given the darkness and the confined terrain. What the Germans possessed that the British didn't have, what no amount of numerical superiority could compensate for, was practiced coordination in night operations. The German army had spent years conducting nocturnal maneuvers. They had developed signals, tactics, and communication systems optimized for darkness. The British had not. Lieutenant Colonel James Thornbury was commanding a British armoured regiment when the German counterattack began. His account, recorded in a 1969 BBC interview that was declassified in 2001, describes the chaos. "We were advancing through what we thought was enemy territory we had already secured. Then, without warning, the desert lit up with tracer fire, phosphorus rounds, anti-tank shells. But the Germans weren't just shooting from one direction. They were firing from multiple angles simultaneously. They had somehow positioned themselves all around us while we were moving forward. We didn't realize we were surrounded until we started taking casualties from behind our own position." The British formations, which moments before had seemed in perfect control, dissolved into confusion. Visibility was approximately 50 meters even with flares. Radio communications were jammed by German electronic warfare units. Vehicle commanders couldn't see their supporting units. Officers couldn't coordinate with neighboring companies. The Germans, by contrast, operated with coherence. They had predetermined assembly points. They had backup communication channels. They moved as a unified organism, while the British fragmented into isolated units. By 05:30 hours, the first major British unit began to collapse. The 9th Armoured Brigade, consisting of 3 Zuru-Zerad men and 120 tanks, found itself cut off from supply lines and surrounded by German positions it couldn't accurately locate in the pre-dawn darkness. The brigade commander, Brigadier John Curry, made the decision to fight through. He ordered a charge directly toward the heaviest concentration of German fire. The result was a massacre. German anti-tank guns, positioned on elevated terrain the British hadn't properly reconnoitred, opened fire at point-blank range. British tanks exploded in orange fireballs. The screams of trapped crews mixed with the sound of machine gun fire. By sunrise at 06:45 hours, the 9th Armoured Brigade had lost 67 tanks, 200 men killed or wounded, and had been forced to surrender as a unit. But that was only one of 3 encircled British formations. The 151st Infantry Brigade, advancing on foot, found itself cut off when German armour appeared from directions the British intelligence had deemed impossible. The unit disintegrated. Survivors scattered into the desert. Over 800 were captured. The 4th Light Armoured Brigade attempted to break out toward the south. They drove directly into a coordinated ambush. German 88mm guns, the most feared anti-tank weapon on the North African battlefield, fired at nearly point-blank range. The British vehicles, lighter and less armoured than German panzers, were shredded. By 08:00 hours, it was clear that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the British encirclement strategy. Instead of surrounding the Germans, the British had allowed themselves to be fragmented and partially surrounded. In his command tent, General Montgomery received reports with growing disbelief. The casualty figures kept climbing. The radio messages from forward units became increasingly desperate, then stopped entirely. The German attack, which should have been impossible given the British numerical advantage, had succeeded through a combination of factors that the British command structure had fatally underestimated. German coordination in darkness, German knowledge of terrain, German willingness to attack when conventional doctrine suggested defense, and British, most critically, the fragmentation of British command when communication failed. By 10:00 hours, the German forces began to withdraw, having achieved their objective: disruption of the British encirclement, preservation of their own forces, and infliction of catastrophic casualties on the enemy. The final accounting was stark. In 12 hours of fighting, 200 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. 147 British tanks were destroyed or abandoned. 3 complete British brigades were tactically defeated. The German forces, despite being numerically inferior, had escaped the encirclement. General Montgomery's precision encirclement had become a British disaster. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts travel, and at what moments of the day or night they reach you. The official British military communique issued at 14:30 hours on November 4th, 1942 stated, "German forces remain contained within the Alamein perimeter. Encirclement proceeding as planned. Minor tactical withdrawals by enemy forces are consistent with strategic pressure. Overall situation remains favorable to British operations." This statement was false. General Montgomery knew it was false when he authorized it. In the command post, Montgomery stood before a large-scale map of the battlefield, studying the disposition of units that were no longer responding to radio calls. His face was rigid, his jaw clenched. Around him, staff officers maintained absolute silence, not from respect, but from fear. Montgomery had built his entire reputation on precision, on the ability to see the battlefield with crystal clarity, on the capacity to predict enemy movements and respond with mechanical efficiency. The chaos unfolding across the Alamein line represented not just military failure, but a fundamental contradiction to everything he had constructed as a commander. "Where," he asked quietly, "are the 9th Armoured Brigade?" No one answered. "Where," he repeated, his voice rising, "are they?" A junior intelligence officer, Lieutenant David Ashford, stepped forward. "Sir, last confirmed position was grid reference 77 Delta. That was at 05, 15 hours, no radio contact since 05:47. They're 2 kilometers inside what we considered secured territory," Montgomery said. "How are they not responding?" "Sir," Ashford began carefully, "the Germans appear to have deployed radio jamming equipment. We're receiving fragmentary reports from units that managed to break through jamming, but the situation appears confused." Confused. Montgomery repeated the word as if it were a curse. "We don't have confusion. We have precision, or we have failure. Confused is what happens to defeated armies." But confused was exactly what the British command structure was experiencing. The problem was structural. Montgomery's battle plan had been predicated on a specific enemy response. When the Germans did something different, when they attacked instead of defending, the entire British command apparatus struggled to adapt. The communication systems were designed for a linear advance, not for a three-dimensional battle with German forces emerging from unexpected directions. Brigadier Auchinleck approached Montgomery with updated casualty figures. The numbers were staggering, over 2,000 confirmed casualties in the British formations, possibly more in units still cut off. "The German counterattack was coordinated," Auchinleck reported. 3 separate German formations attacked simultaneously. They must have been planning this before we even launched our assault. Montgomery considered this. It suggested a level of German intelligence about British operations that should have been impossible. The British had been meticulous about operational security. No radio traffic about the attack had been transmitted until the barrage commenced. How had the Germans known? The answer, which wouldn't be fully understood until decades later, lay in a combination of factors. German reconnaissance aircraft had observed the British assembly areas. German signals intelligence had intercepted fragmentary communications, and General Stumme, lacking Rommel's aggressive instincts, had prepared defensive positions that would allow him to attack if the British advance became disorganized. When the British advance did become disorganized, when darkness and gaps between units created vulnerability, Stumme had recognized the opportunity with the clarity of a chess master seeing a winning combination. But there was another factor, more human and more tragic. Captain Friedrich Weber was a company commander in the 21st Panzer Division. His unit had been positioned directly in the path of the British advance. When the British barrage began, Weber's position was obliterated. Over 60% of his company was killed in the initial bombardment, but Weber survived. Buried under debris for nearly 2 hours, he dug himself out at 23:45 hours and found what remained of his unit, 12 men out of an original 43. Rather than retreat or surrender, Weber made the decision to hold his position. When German command ordered the counterattack, Weber's 12 survivors became the focal point of a German assault that punched directly through the gap between two British regiments. Weber's objective wasn't to achieve some grand tactical maneuver. It was simply to survive, to hold until German reinforcements arrived, to prevent the British from overrunning his position. His determination to hold, multiplied across dozens of similar German positions, created the tactical coherence that turned a British numerical advantage into a British catastrophe. But Weber wouldn't survive the battle. During the German counterattack at Epifeu, 30 hours, he was shot by a British machine gunner. He died trying to stop a British tank from advancing through his position. His death was meaningless in the context of the larger battle. It changed nothing, but it was recorded in the diary of Private Ernst Hahn, who was one of Weber's 12 survivors. Friedrich died at 04:31 hours. He was trying to stop the tank with a Panzerfaust. The machine gun got him first. He fell into a shell crater. I couldn't reach him. The tank rolled over the crater. After the battle, we couldn't find his body. The German offensive, despite being smaller in scale than the British operation, succeeded because it was built on the foundation of individuals like Friedrich Weber, men fighting for survival who created moments of tactical success that German command transformed into operational victory. By 09:00 hours, the situation on the British side had stabilized somewhat. Montgomery had managed to redirect reserves toward the breakthrough areas. German forces, having achieved their immediate objectives, had begun withdrawing to prepared defensive positions, but the damage was irreversible. The British had lost 200 men in a single night. The Germans had inflicted greater casualties than they themselves numbered. And most critically, the British encirclement strategy had failed. General Montgomery issued new orders: defensive consolidation, reorganization of scattered units, and preparation for renewed offensive operations to begin the following day. But that night had cost him something more valuable than soldiers or tanks. It had cost him the appearance of invincibility. The myth that his precision planning could overcome any German maneuver had been shattered in 12 hours of darkness. The full casualty figures weren't released to the public until 1945. The official accounts attributed the losses to enemy coordination and difficult terrain. What they didn't mention was that the British encirclement had been based on faulty assumptions about German behavior. The British had assumed the Germans would do what was tactically sensible. Instead, the Germans had done what was necessary for survival. The lesson, embedded in declassified documents from 1946, was articulated by Montgomery himself in a private memo. The Battle of Alamein demonstrated that numerical superiority is not sufficient against an enemy capable of adaptation and willing to accept catastrophic risk. We assumed the Germans would defend passively. Instead, they attacked. The night belonged to them because they were willing to operate in conditions where we sought to impose order. Darkness is the enemy's friend when he accepts confusion as the price of victory. If this story surprised you, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. In Berlin, at the Wehrmacht High Command, General Adolf Hitler received the first reports of the Alamein counterattack at 09:15 hours on November 4, 1942. The initial reports claimed German victory. German forces had driven back the British. The encirclement had been disrupted. Hitler smiled. For the first time in weeks, he smiled. But within hours, more accurate reports arrived. The German forces had achieved tactical surprise, but not strategic victory. The British remained numerically superior. The German breakthrough had been contained. The situation remained critical. The smile faded. What Hitler received was essentially a fairy tale, a story that began with German brilliance and ended with ambiguous results. Military commanders, understanding that Hitler's mood determined operational orders, often shaped reports to match his expectations. A tactical surprise became a victorious counterattack. A successful defense against encirclement became a breakthrough. The reality was more complex and more troubling. General Stuma's counterattack had been based on desperation, not strategy. It had succeeded because of British disorganization, not because of German numerical strength, and it had ultimately failed to achieve any sustainable objective. But this complexity was lost in translation as the report moved up the chain of command toward Hitler's office. At the same moment, in Montgomery's command tent in North Africa, a very different conversation was occurring. Montgomery was facing a crisis of confidence. His staff officers, who had approached him the previous morning with professional deference, now looked at him with subtle doubt. The losses had been tremendous. The strategic situation, while still favorable to the British, had been compromised by the night's chaos. Montgomery made a command decision that revealed his character, not his tactical genius, but his fundamental psychology as a leader. He decided to claim victory. At 11:00 hours, Montgomery issued an official statement to his senior commanders. "The enemy has attempted to disrupt our encirclement through a coordinated but ultimately futile counterattack. This attack demonstrates the desperation of German and Italian forces. British operations will continue as planned. The enemy remains contained. Victory approaches." This statement was technically inaccurate. The British encirclement had been disrupted. The enemy wasn't fully contained. Victory was far from assured. But it served a purpose. It restored confidence to an officer corps shaken by the night's casualties. It provided a coherent narrative to replace the chaos of actual events. Montgomery understood something fundamental about warfare that many theorists miss. The battle for control of narrative is often more important than the physical battle itself. If officers believed they were winning, they would fight harder, take greater risks, and accept greater casualties in pursuit of that victory. If they believed they were losing, they would be cautious, hesitant, and ultimately defeated regardless of numerical advantage. By issuing a false statement of victory, Montgomery was actually fighting the next battle, the one that would determine whether the tactical losses of the night could be converted into strategic advantage. It worked. The British forces, despite their losses and disorganization, launched a renewed assault on November 5th. The Germans, exhausted and knowing that reinforcements from Europe couldn't arrive in time, were forced into gradually retreating eastward. By November 7th, the Axis forces had abandoned their Alamein positions and were in full retreat toward Libya. The Battle of Alamein became a British victory. History recorded it as such. Montgomery became a hero. His reputation was restored and elevated. But the victory was built on a foundation of uncomfortable truths that Montgomery never publicly acknowledged. First, the British had come perilously close to tactical defeat on the night of November 4th. Second, German forces, despite being numerically inferior and strategically hopeless, had nearly succeeded in destroying the British encirclement through a combination of tactical brilliance and willingness to accept casualties. Third, the British victory was secured not through brilliant planning, but through superior industrial capacity. More replacement soldiers, more replacement tanks, more capacity to absorb losses and continue attacking. These truths were buried in classified files. The official history became British precision defeated German desperation. Montgomery's strategic vision overwhelmed Rommel's tactical flexibility. The actual history was messier. Both sides made critical errors. The Germans executed their limited resources with remarkable skill. The British absorbed devastating casualties, but had enough reserve capacity to continue the assault. In a classified memo written in December 1942 by General Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, the real assessment was recorded. The Alamein victory demonstrates that numerical and material superiority will ultimately prevail against tactical excellence if the superior force maintains strategic composure. However, we came dangerously close to defeat on the night of 4 November. Had German forces possessed even slightly greater resources, or had British command maintained slightly less discipline, the outcome could have been reversed. This should not be misunderstood as a critique of General Montgomery's leadership. Rather, it should be understood as a warning that even well-planned operations remain vulnerable to enemy adaptation, and that overconfidence is the greatest threat to operational success. This memo was classified for 60 years. When it was finally declassified in 2002, it provided historians with the context they needed to understand that Alamein was not a victory achieved through superiority of planning, but a victory achieved through superiority of resources. Montgomery, however, spent the rest of his life cultivating the image of Alamein as a victory achieved through superior strategic vision. He wrote about it extensively in his memoirs. He lectured about it at military academies. He used it as the foundation for his reputation as one of history's great military commanders. What he never publicly addressed was the night of November 4th, the moment when German desperation nearly shattered British precision, and when only the British capacity to absorb losses and continue fighting prevented catastrophic defeat. That night remained classified. That night remained a secret. That night remained untold until declassification released the documents. In a German field hospital approximately 40 kilometers east of Alamein, a wounded German officer named Hauptmann, Captain Karl Reitmann, lay on a stretcher, waiting for surgery. His left leg had been shattered by British artillery. He would survive the war, but he would lose the leg. Reitmann had commanded a panzer company during the counterattack on November 4th. His company had initially consisted of 12 tanks. By the end of the battle, he had 3 tanks remaining and had lost 23 of his crew members. While waiting for surgery, in a state of pain-induced semi-consciousness, Reitmann dictated observations to a medical orderly, who recorded them. The British thought they had us. They thought the encirclement was complete, but we attacked. We didn't have enough to win. We barely had enough to survive, but survival was the objective. The British had so many soldiers, so many machines, that they couldn't imagine fighting from a position where you must win. They planned for victory. We planned for another day. Reitmann's observations captured something essential about the battle that official histories often missed: the psychological dimension of fighting from desperation versus fighting from strength. The British, numerically superior and strategically confident, had planned the Alamein operation with the assumption that they would slowly wear down German resistance. They expected the battle to take days, perhaps weeks. They built their logistics, their communication systems, their tactical doctrine around the expectation of gradual attrition. The Germans, desperate and strategically condemned, operated from the assumption that they must avoid gradual attrition at all costs. They must attack when the opportunity arose. They must accept catastrophic risks. They must fight as if every battle might be their last. On the night of November 4th, these two different approaches to warfare collided, and for one brief moment, German desperation nearly overwhelmed British confidence. But there was a human cost to that moment. Friedrich Weber, the young captain mentioned in earlier accounts, was one of approximately 800 German soldiers killed or mortally wounded during the counterattack. Weber was 24 years old. He had been with his unit for only 4 months. He had never seen combat before November 1942. His body was never recovered. It was buried in the sand by the subsequent British advance and lost to history. But his younger brother, Hans Weber, survived the war and wrote a memoir published in 1968. In it, he recorded his understanding of Friedrich's death, pieced together from conversations with Friedrich's fellow soldiers after the war. My brother Friedrich died not for strategic victory, but for tactical necessity. He died holding ground that would be abandoned within hours. He died so that German forces could retreat in slightly better order. His death was meaningful in the context of military necessity, but meaningless in the context of historical outcome. He enabled a small tactical advantage that became a small German defeat within 12 hours. He died so that the German forces could be a slightly less disorganized retreat. That was all. Multiply Friedrich Weber by thousands, and you have the human reality of the Alamein battle. The British losses were 560 total casualties, killed, wounded, and captured. Of those, 200 occurred on the night of November 4th. The remaining 360 occurred over the subsequent 12 days, as the British pressed their advantage against increasingly demoralized German and Italian forces. The German losses were approximately 400 total casualties, with approximately 2,000 occurring on the night of November 4th, and approximately 400 German and Italian soldiers captured as the Axis forces disintegrated. But the statistics obscure the human reality. Each casualty represented a specific person with a specific story. Each death represented a family destroyed, a future erased, a possibility eliminated. In the aftermath of the battle, as the British consolidated their victory and the German forces retreated eastward, there was a moment of reflection among the survivors. British soldiers, marching across the battlefield in the aftermath, encountered the remains of the night of November 4th, burned-out tanks, abandoned equipment, bodies partially buried in sand, the physical evidence of a battle that conventional military history rarely acknowledged with honesty. One British private, George Middleton, recorded in his diary, November 6, 1942, "We are collecting bodies, German and Italian. Some have been buried by sand, some have been burned inside their tanks. The officers say it was a great victory. Perhaps it was, but it smells like failure. It smells like death that didn't need to happen. The Germans fought well. They were outnumbered and they still almost defeated us. That should tell us something about their capability, not about our superiority." Middleton survived the war and, in 1998, gave an interview to the BBC that was declassified in 2002. In that interview, he discussed the psychological aftermath of Alamein. "We were told we had won a great victory, that we had defeated German forces through superior planning and organization. But most of us knew that we had barely survived a night where the Germans nearly destroyed us. We had more soldiers, we had more machines, we had better supply lines, but the Germans had something we didn't have on that night. They had desperation, and desperation is a dangerous weapon." The declassification of these personal accounts changed how historians understood the Battle of Alamein. Rather than the story of a brilliant British commander defeating a German force through superior tactical planning, it became the story of two armies colliding in darkness, with the outcome determined not by genius, but by the ability to absorb losses and continue fighting. In 1946, the British War Office published an official history of the North African campaign. The chapter on Alamein devoted significant space to General Montgomery's strategic vision and the precision of British planning. It described the German counterattack on November 4th as a desperate but ultimately futile attempt to disrupt the encirclement. The word desperate was accurate. The word futile was partially inaccurate. The German counterattack had, in fact, succeeded in disrupting the British encirclement. It had killed or wounded over 3,000 British soldiers. It had destroyed 147 British tanks. It had nearly achieved tactical victory against overwhelming odds, but calling it futile served a narrative purpose. It allowed the British victory to be understood as inevitable, as the product of superior planning rather than the product of greater resources surviving tactical defeat. This narrative persisted for nearly 60 years. In 1998, when various Alamein archives were declassified by the British government, a new historical understanding became possible. The declassified documents revealed pre-battle German intelligence assessments that accurately predicted British intentions, evidence that General Stumme had specifically prepared defensive positions that would allow for rapid counterattack, communication transcripts showing German commanders understood they couldn't win but could prevent British encirclement through immediate attack, casualty figures showing that German losses on November 4th were disproportionately high, but that German personnel losses were actually lower than British personnel losses when calculated as a percentage of engaged forces. These documents, available to scholars, created a new historical interpretation. The Battle of Alamein was not a brilliant British victory over a German force. It was a survival situation where British numerical superiority allowed them to absorb devastating losses and continue the assault until German forces, exhausted and outnumbered, were forced to retreat. In 2001, the German government declassified parallel archives from the German army perspective. These documents revealed General Stumme's specific assessment that German forces couldn't win at Alamein, but could inflict such heavy casualties on British forces that the British might lose political will to continue, evidence that the November 4th counterattack was calculated to be catastrophically expensive, but necessary to avoid complete encirclement casualty projections that German commanders understood they would. Lose 500 men, but hope to kill or wound 4 British soldiers. The German calculation was accurate. The British did lose over 3 casualties in a single night, but the British had enough reserve capacity to absorb those losses and continue fighting. The Germans did not. The strategic outcome was thus determined not by tactical brilliance but by industrial capacity. The side that could replace losses faster than they occurred would eventually win. That was Britain. In 2003, historian Dr. Richard Holmes published a comprehensive reassessment of Alamein based on the declassified documents. His book, The Desperate Victory, Alamein, and the Question of Strategic Inevitability, argued that the Battle of Alamein was not a victory achieved through superior planning or tactical brilliance. It was a victory achieved through superior industrial capacity. The British could absorb losses that would have destroyed a lesser nation. The Germans could not. The night of November 4th, 1942, came perilously close to producing a tactical German victory that, though strategically unsustainable, would have devastated British operations for weeks. That it did not occur was due not to British superiority, but to British capacity to maintain discipline and continue fighting despite devastating losses. Holmes's book became required reading at military academies around the world. It changed how military commanders understood the relationship between planning, tactics, and material capacity. But even Holmes's reassessment couldn't fully capture the human reality of that night. Karl Reitmann, the wounded German captain, survived the war and emigrated to Argentina in 1950. He lived until 1989 and, in his later years, kept a photograph. himself in uniform before the battle, standing next to Friedrich Weber, his subordinate officer. On the back of the photograph, Reitman had written, "Friedrich Weber died 4th of November 1942, 04:31 hours. He held the position so we could retreat. Germany lost the war because we had to retreat from men like Friedrich." Reitman had written this in 1970 during a period of personal reflection. He had never shared the photograph or the inscription publicly, but he kept it. Throughout his life in Argentina, he kept that photograph and the memory of Friedrich Weber and the night when German desperation nearly overwhelmed British confidence. When Reitman died in 1989, the photograph was discovered by his daughter, Clara Reitman. She recognized the historical significance and donated it to the German military archive in 2001, along with a letter explaining her father's role in the battle. Clara Reitman also donated her father's personal diary, which contained entries from the week following November 4th. One entry, dated November 8, 1942, reads, "We are retreating. The British are pursuing, but not aggressively. They are exhausted. We are exhausted. Nobody won this battle. We simply survived it slightly worse than they did. When the history is written, it will say the British won through superior planning. The truth is more terrible. Both sides nearly destroyed themselves, and the side with more resources to replace what was destroyed emerged from the rubble slightly more intact. This is victory in modern war, not triumph, not genius, just survival with fewer losses than the other side. God help us all." When Clara Reitman's donation to the archive was catalogued in 2002, it became part of the declassified Alamein materials. Historians began to reference her father's diary as evidence of the German perspective on the battle. By 2010, the narrative of Alamein had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer understood as a brilliant British strategic victory. It was understood as a grueling mutual attrition battle where British industrial capacity allowed survival where German desperation did not. The casualty figures on November 4th, the 200 British losses, became recognized as one of the highest single-night casualty rates for British forces in any engagement during the entire North African campaign. General Montgomery, still alive until 1976, never publicly acknowledged the danger that his forces had faced on that night. He continued to defend his strategic decisions and refused to admit that the British had come close to tactical defeat. But military strategists came to understand that Alamein represented something different from what popular history claimed, not the triumph of superior planning, but the demonstration that industrial society had changed the nature of warfare. Planning and tactics mattered, but material capacity, logistical strength, and the ability to absorb losses ultimately determined victory. Friedrich Weber remained buried somewhere in the Alamein desert. His body was never recovered. His grave is unknown. But his death, and the deaths of thousands like him, changed military theory. They demonstrated that desperation could create tactical capability that numerical superiority alone could not match. They showed that men fighting to survive could nearly defeat men fighting for conquest. And they revealed finally that the night of November 4th, 1942, was not a British triumph, but a mutual catastrophe, where the side with more capacity to replace what was destroyed emerged slightly less destroyed. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cases and curiosities from World War II. Thank you for following the story. See you in the next video.